Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, at long last, it's finally time. Our commander for this installment is none other than Meren of Clan Nel Toth, the Golgari Master of Necromancy. She's a 4-mana, 3/4 human shaman who collects experience for us as our creatures die, and can pull creatures out of the graveyard on our end step, putting them directly into play if we have enough experience, or just going back to hand if not. She's also heckin' amazing. Meren's been a popular commander for a long time, and her page has had plenty of time to fill up with some of the very best necromantic selections. Cheating free creatures into play is one of my favorite things to do in Magic, and that's exactly her bread and butter. It's difficult to make a bad Meren deck. She provides such a good baseline of value that it's hard not to take advantage of it. I think the only way you could probably manage that is if your deck contained no creatures at all. And even then, I think there are some clever players out there who would still find a way to make that work. So I guess I just mean for this to be a disclaimer at the start that frankly applies to any and all deck tune-ups out there. To add great cards to this deck, we have to cut good cards from this deck. Meren isn't the oldest commander deck I own, but she's been in my stable of decks for a long time now, so I'm pretty excited for this one. Alright, let's take Meren's average deck list from EDHREC and import it into the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. So yeah, Meren is completely perfect, actually. I have no cuts to make. The deck list is solid exactly as it is. Necromancy is the best strategy in Magic. GG's, let's wrap it up. I hope you've enjoyed your time with Meren of Clan Nel Toth. If you have any other recommendations for your fellow Meren players, make sure you leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and thanks for watching. Okay, for real this time. I'll try to keep my love of the graveyard in check. I do definitely spy some upgrades we can make, so let's tackle them in the following 3 ways. First, acceleration, next, advantage, and finally, the Undertakers. First up, let's look at that mana. The broadest and probably most important lesson that we should learn from Meren is basically never send a spell to do a creature's job. Enchantments, artifacts, instants, and sorceries are just that. They do their one thing, and they probably do it really well. But creatures are more than that. Creatures represent a blocker, an attacker, an experience point, a blood artist trigger, a piece of sacrifice fodder, and more important, a game piece that Meren can repeat over and over and over. We'll be upgrading our creature cards in this Meren deck for sure, but as a general lesson, we should be very stingy with the non-creature spells that appear in this list. In this particular section, I'm going to be applying that lesson just to the mana acceleration options, but it really should go for every aspect of Meren's strategy too. Golgari Signet is my first chop. I like you, I like how cheap you are, but there's a reason Arcane Signet and the Talismans don't show up in this list, you know? We want a creature to help with this instead. Next is Primal Growth, and already I think I'll have to pause and explain this a bit. Yes, this card allows us to sacrifice a creature and get more lands. There is totally synergy there. It's just not as good a synergy compared to other mana acceleration options we could play instead. The end goal of this spell is a dead creature and 2 lands. Well, we're already flush with sack outlets though, so we don't need a sorcery to help us get dead creatures. And as for getting lands, well, the Wood Elves helps us with exactly the same job. In fact, hold that thought, because I'm gonna circle back to Wood Elves later when I start adding cards. Before I do, I'm cutting 2 creatures first. Land of War Elves is fine, but it's not splendid. Skull Prophet I like too, but I'm not enamored by it. These 2 can help us in interesting ways, and if they die, we're likely to earn an experience counter from them, so the tempo loss that other decks would experience by losing a mana dork isn't even severe here. However, my concern with them is that they're extremely crummy late-game draws, and even more importantly, that they're not the kind of thing we want to sacrifice and revive multiple times. I'm generally suspicious of creatures in Meren decks that have to wait a turn to do their thing. Meren can pull creatures in and out of the graveyard so many times in one turn that it's as though she's flickering them. Plain and simple, enter the battlefield effects are our biggest friends here. Skull Prophet is really cool, but like I said before, to add good cards, you gotta cut good cards, and the cards I want to add have served me so well over the years. Which cards are they? Well, let's circle back to that Wood Elves I mentioned earlier. Wood Elves showed up in the original Meren precon, and it shows up in about 51% of the over 3,000 Meren decks out there now. But Farhaven Elf, a very similar elf who also helps fix our colors, only shows up in 17% of Meren decks. Springbloom Druid, who is also really similar, doesn't even show up on Meren's page at all. I enjoy these for the same reasons everyone loves Wood Elves. They're ramp, they're skull clampable, they can be brought back multiple times with Meren for even more value, but what especially sends them over the edge for me is that since Meren is a removal magnet that everyone wants to get rid of, they provide us a more consistent form of mana advantage that will allow us to make sure we can cast Meren again in the future. And if you happen to use effects like Avenger of Zendikar in your deck, the additional landfall is also really important there too. I'm actually not done with the Mana X Elf Oration, though. My favorite from among all of them is Yavimaya Granger. This one has Echo, so it'll wind up right in the graveyard all of its own accord, ready to be brought back with Meren, even if we don't have a sacrifice outlet. Before I leave the mana section, real quick, I'm gonna trim the Evolving Wilds and the Terramorphic Expanse. I don't like these lands much in 2-color decks. The end result is a tapped land that gives us one of our colors. If I'm gonna play a tapped land, I'd prefer that it get me both of my colors. If your list uses an Avenger like I mentioned earlier, or Life from the Loam effects, or a Get Brog or something like that, that can be a perfectly good reason to keep these lands. But if you want them just for color fixing and for no other reason, then they're just meh. Think critically about them, that's all I'm saying. No card is immune to close examination. And what cards am I swapping them for? Well, 2 cards printed in Commander Legends, Guildless Commons and Command Beacon. Command Beacon was originally printed one time in a precon and was like $20 or $30 for like years. It's finally been reprinted and it is cheap to get, but I doubt it will stay that way for long. Meren gets removed a lot, so play stuff like this to make it easier to get her back. As for Guildless Commons, I have an affinity for these types of bounce lands in graveyard decks. Yeah, it's colorless mana, but you still feel a lot more mana secure when your opening hand contains a bounce land. And even better, playing this on turn 2 usually means you end up with 8 cards in your hand and therefore must discard to hand size, so you can cheekily start filling the graveyard ASAP. Alright, let's get to part 2. Let's talk about advantage. In every one of these videos, I put the price of the average list both before and after our swaps and upgrades. When I loaded up the Meren list, I was pretty surprised at the price that I saw. It's not the highest we've seen in this series, but it is more than usual. So 2 things on that point. First, I'm pretty confident that the bulk of the price we're seeing here largely derives from the number of tutor effects that we see in the average deck list. A handful of $20 cards really ratchets up that price tag pretty quickly. And second, I want to reiterate that Meren's a good commander whether you're playing her on a budget of $400 or $40. You categorically do not need things like tutors to make her deck good. Remember, EDHREC is just collecting the data and then reporting what we see on average. Meren has been around for a while, so players have experience with her, and they've had a lot of time to improve the deck, which also means that the cards in that deck have had enough space to accumulate in price over the years. You should absolutely build however it is that you like. The information is there to do with as you will, and Meren's going to be happy either way. And don't forget, EDHREC has awesome filters to use too. If you want to find awesome cards that don't break the bank, there's a low-cost budget filter that helps filter to the least expensive lists in the database. If you want to see the information for decks that definitely include or definitely don't include specific cards, Advanced Filters is your jam. Seriously, if you aren't using the filters yet, I can't recommend it enough, because they sculpt your results to help you find recommendations from other like-minded players. Nothing will improve your deck building experience faster than these. So why is this guy bringing up budget and filtering stuff when we're in the middle of a Meren video when we're supposed to move on to card advantage? Well, I know it was a long, windy road to get here, but there's an interesting relationship going on between the tutor effects and the card advantage effects that appear in this deck, which gives us an opportunity to highlight an important facet for both budget and non-budget Meren players alike. I'm not going to go chopping a bunch of the expensive tutor cards that appear in the list because I do want to keep it pretty close to what the average Meren player has converged upon. But with that said, if you don't want to play a bunch of these expensive tutor spells, card advantage effects are really going to help you out as a replacement to them, because they will help you dig to find the stuff you need. But even if you are playing lots of tutors, don't let that come at the expense of other card advantage effects. If you use a tutor card to go find some plan, but then an opponent knocks that plan out, then you're going to be down on card economy compared to your opponents, so you need some way to catch back up. A way that isn't just more tutors. Alright, let's just get to the cards. If we weren't staying cost neutral in this list, I would immediately recommend Yawgmoth and Guardian Project. Yawgmoth is a terrific sack outlet, draw effect, and discard outlet if needed, and Guardian Project is also just astonishing. Meren has creatures entering the battlefield over and over and over, so this thing can get totally gross. As it stands though, we're not breaking the bank, and I want to get more draw effects in here in some form or fashion. So here are Smothering Abomination and Midnight Reaper. We sacrifice a lot of stuff in this deck, so these keep our hand full, sometimes even overly full, so we're forced to discard. They're great picks, and you're never going to be sad to see them. We have to make cuts to make room though, and Evolutionary Leap is the first one that gets me. Paying 1 mana to sacrifice creatures doesn't sound like a lot to the uninitiated, but with the amount of sacrificing that we want to do, it's genuinely a bigger toll than it looks like. The random creatures we could find with this just aren't as important as the draw engines we just added, which are creatures and therefore recurable, and they're also not as important as free sacrifice outlets too. Only 29% of Meren decks were using Evolutionary Leap anyway, so it looks like Meren players are collectively coming to the same conclusion. I'm also cutting Village Rites. I actually really like this card, but like I said before, I want our non-creature spells to do things that we can't get on creatures. If we can do the thing efficiently with a creature, we should pick the creature option over the spell option every time, because it interlocks more with the cogs that move in our deck. Village Rites reminds me a lot of Primal Growth, to be honest. I prefer the creature draw options more than the one-off spell version, just like I preferred the creature ramp options more than the one-off spell version. And again, these cards absolutely have synergy with the things that our deck does, but other options just have a smidge more synergy. I said earlier that I'm not going to go around chopping a bunch of pricey tutors just for the heck of it, and that's true, but I am still going to make a cut on a pricey-ish tutor card here. Fiend Artisan. This can birthing pod our creatures, kind of, but A, it takes a turn to do it, and B, we have to pay full price for whatever it is that we're finding. I prefer cheating mana costs personally, and I like doing it right away rather than waiting a turn for Summoning Sickness to wear off. So here I will be exchanging a creature for a non-creature card, because that's just how good this thing is. If you like tutor effects that put things right into play, use Pattern of Rebirth. This thing's totally busto. Slap it on a Sakura Tribe Elder and crack it for a land and slam a Machias into play. Better yet, unlike the Artisan, this can be done at instant speed, so we can respond to any gameplay scenario by searching through the toolbox for whatever creature helps us out of a sticky situation. Alright, I think it's about time for our third and final section. Let's bring out the dead. Judging by the data, Meren players have largely converged around a core group of cards as win conditions. You know, your Blood Artists, your Kokashos, your Zulaports, your Grey Merchants, and so on. I'm not necessarily worried about upgrading those options so much as upgrading the stuff that surrounds them. After all, improving the support structure of a deck helps you get to a place where you can even deploy those win conditions in the first place. So for our final section, I want to make sure that we're putting the Necro in Necromancy. Up first, Putrefy. I appreciate the instant speed ability here, an effect that creatures can't necessarily afford us. However, a thing that has served me best in my Meren deck is an effect that almost no creatures have. Board wipes. I'm swapping Putrefy for Oblivion Stone. It can also activate at instant speed, but most importantly, it hinders enemy objects that our deck doesn't contain a lot of. Mana rocks, potential planeswalkers, that sort of thing. But even beyond how nicely this gets us out of sticky situations, it sends everything to the graveyard. So even if we do have collateral damage blowback when the O-Stone pops off, it's the type of damage that our deck is suited to recover from. Next is Butcher of Malakir. If you're playing Meren on a budget, ignore this part, because this is a very cheap card with a great effect. But if you've got the level of tunedness that we're seeing in this average list, I think it's time for the Butcher to go. We have a lot of sacrifice-based removal here already. A lot. And this one is just the clunkiest of them. 7 mana is a lot of mana, and I'd rather play a different creature in this slot that will help us control the board in a different way. Massacre Worm. Still fairly affordable after its reprinting in this year's core set, Massacre Worm is an answer against token decks whose large board is immune to our other sacrifice-based removal options. So this is a great thing to have in a toolbox deck with this many tutors. Massacre Worm pairs beautifully with our Fleshbag Marauder effects because it reduces the number of fodder creatures our opponents can have, leaving only their biggest and best behind ripe for the picking. We can even play the worm, sacrifice it, and then bring it back with Meren on the end step to give enemy creatures -4 for the turn. Plus, Massacre Worm can just win games. That life loss ability happens anytime an enemy creature dies, not just on the turn that the worm entered. But the thing that really pushes me over the line with the worm is how well it works with Living Death. If we arrange a big Living Death play to reanimate all the dead creatures, inevitably some of our opponents will have goodies to bring back too. Bringing back Massacre Worm with all of them turns our opponent's benefit into their worst nightmare. And you know what? Speaking of Living Death, I have another card to add here too. Twilight's Call. 6 mana to revive all of the dead creatures, or 8 mana if we want to do it as an instant. It's not exactly a second Living Death, but it's also basically a second Living Death. Does it wipe the board like Living Death? No. Do we care? Also no. Wiping the board is not the part that we care about for that spell. When we're buried aliving and entombing and sacrificing our own board at will in preparation for spells like this effect is often just game-winning, or it gives us so much value that it becomes next to impossible to knock us off of that winning position. And don't discount that instant speed option on Twilight's Call too. I've pulled some awesome tricks with this one. I'm sure all Graveyard players have had the experience of a staring contest against an opponent who has a Scavenger Grounds on the field. I've managed to scoot out from under that by moving to the end step, trying to revive my best creature from the yard with Meren's ability, prompting that opponent to crack the Scavenger Grounds, and then instant speeding Twilight's Call to get everything back before it gets exiled. TLDR, this spell is rad. I've got one last card to add, but I've got to chop a card before I can add it. The card I'm cutting, crazy though it may seem, is Gerard. Gerard is a great potential win condition because it drains life from our enemies, but here's my issue with it. Most of our creatures are just really small power-wise. We aren't sacking 10 power creatures. Most of our creatures have like 2 or 3 power, which just isn't a huge punch. We have a few creatures with decent power that would take a chunk out of enemy life totals, and once again, Gerard is not a bad card in a Meren deck. I've just personally noticed times where it stumbled a little more often than I was comfortable with. This card makes our good creatures even better, but I often find that the amount of hate Meren draws makes it hard to get the original good creatures out in the first place, which makes this card feel just a little bit win more. Sorry, buddy. I'm really excited for the final card that I want to add here, but I want to quickly dispel any anticipation that longtime viewers may be suspecting. No, the card I'm adding isn't Tombstone Stairwell. I've recommended this card in the Teysa Karlov video, and it's an amazing card. But when I discussed that card in the Teysa video, it was $2, and now it's like $15, so it's out of budget for us. Still a heckin' amazing card, though. It just won't be the one that I'm adding here. Just consider it an honorable mention. No, the card that I'm adding here comes courtesy of artist Aaron Radney, who recommended a card that I was frankly astonished to realize I'd overlooked for all of these years playing Meren. Like, it's always a little awkward when you've had a deck for years and then you hear someone else who's like, oh, this would go great in every Meren deck, or, well, Jotha players would be crazy not to run this card, or this is an auto-include for every Atraxa deck. And meanwhile, you're sitting here with actual years of experience playing the deck and you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely an auto-include, just like the 124 other auto-includes for my deck. I can only play 100 cards, Steve. But honestly, Aaron did me a real solid with his recommendation, because it made me do a double take and made me realize that I probably should have been playing this all these years. And if you can warm the heart of a cold necromancer like me, I mean, that's impressive. So what's the card? A simple, unassuming mitotic slime. When it dies, it bursts into 2/2/2 slimes, and when they die, they burst into 1/1 slimes. It's maybe hard to convey exactly why I love this so much, but this many bodies, 4/5 mana, is exactly the kind of thing that Meren is built to abuse. Let's just look at the support that this card brings to the deck. That's 7 mana with one altar and 14 with the other. That's 7 Blood Artist or Conrad triggers. That's 7 experience counters, so this creature will fill up Meren all on its own. That's an extremely annoying number of blockers. It's 12 cards milled with Altar of Dementia, and it's a lot of cards drawn off of Moldavine Reclamation. It's 7 bodies for 5 mana, or more commonly, since Meren can revive it again on the end step, it's 14 bodies in a single turn. And that is value. Alright, that ought to do it. Our final Meren list. You can find a link to the deck list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. And I've also added my own personal Meren deck list down there too, just for kicks. I hope you've enjoyed this experience with Meren, and if you have any other recommendations that you think your fellow necromancers ought to be grave digging too, make sure you leave them in the comments 6 feet below. Thanks so much for watching.